So a bit of a brief history here for you. Montalcino, we'll talk about Sangiovese and its clones, and then of course the denominations of Montalcino. So to get right into the history, and again, try not to go back too far, but it's still relevant in how Montalcino developed and how it developed differently than, say, Florence. And we go back to the 1500s in the 4-year War of Montalcino. I highlight this as a specific sort of overview, only because I think it's relevant that the Renaissance really never impacted Montalcino. You don't see great works of art like you would find scattered throughout Florence and all the areas that were under Medici rule getting Medici love. Because Lorenzo de' Medici and then his predecessors and subsequent followers, they really drew for us the beautiful artwork and bringing poetry and art and love of passion for the Tuscan landscapes through iconic imagery in the Renaissance period. But when you had Montalcino, which was basically an annex under the Republic of Siena, and there was this really intense 4-year war where the Republic of Siena was trying to fight Florence. When that was done and the Republic of Siena lost, the area of Montalcino became under the Medici rule, and really Lorenzo and Cosimo, they really didn't give Montalcino a lot of love in terms of bringing great art and driving the Renaissance into the area of Montalcino. So it remains sort of a medieval town with a very beautiful but old structure of the 14th century fortezza on top of the hill, which is a really beautiful and iconic piece of Montalcino's history. But you won't see a great impact of the Medici rule there. Then Italy unified in 1865, and it's hard for some folks to remember that Italy is younger as a unified country than the United States. I always find that interesting. It was really separated as various regions and kingdoms of Italy, and you see that translated in everything from culture, language, food, wine, every aspect of Italy. This is what makes it so compelling to travel to. Every part of Italy is so unique. There are over 600 registered dialects in Italy, which is often hard for me, as someone that is fluent in Italian, to understand region to region, and even for Italians when they're in their region that have friends from other regions to understand language, dialect, it's completely different. But really the foundation of that unification as it impacted Montalcino was that a train came to the hamlet of Toriniere, which is in that north and east portion that we'll see on the map here in a minute. And so that allowed some exposure for the sweet Muscadello grape, and the experimentation of Sangiovese was basically brought to light. At the time, there was only really one family or one individual that was making quality wine from, at the time, Brunello grapes, but as we all know now, Sangiovese grapes, Sangiovese Grosso. It was Clemente Santi. In 1869, he then went on to the agricultural fair in the town of Montepulciano, which is about 20 plus kilometers or 40 kilometers from the area of Montalcino, and he won 2 silver medals for a wine called Vino Rosso Scelto di Brunello. And that was the first documentation, really, of the category of wines from Brunello grapes, or later be called Sangiovese, as I said, of quality. And then in 1879, he started making 100% Sangiovese wines. So again, he was about 100 years ahead of his time. This is why Bionde Santi is such a critical piece of the history and a great link to the agricultural impact of Sangiovese in the area of Montalcino. You get into the 1930s, phylloxera just crushes Montalcino. At the time, you look back in 1869, 1879, there was already starting to see that influence of phylloxera in France, some sort of myth and legend of Bionde Santi, Clemente Santi, making some wines, grafting some rootstock even back then, but that's all sort of lore and legend, really. But in 1930, phylloxera did a number on Montalcino, just like the rest of Italy and Europe had suffered. So you'll see this sort of history of tragedy repeating itself in and around Montalcino, and it really relates to what we see today. The youth of the winemaking culture in Montalcino is really interesting. 60% of Montalcino is organically farmed. One could argue that this is because it is such a young winemaking culture. It doesn't have 200, 300 years of history rooted in deep family tradition. It doesn't have sort of this homage to this is the way we've always done it. It's always been moving forward, and it's moved forward basically because it's suffered time and time again. Post-World War II, which was largely a culture for wood, forestry, farming related to those sorts of trades with regards to wood, carpentry, cobblers, tailors. These jobs were taken as oil, electricity, plastics became more prevalent in and around Italy. There was less of a need for woodworkers like carpenters, etc. And so this really decimated the community of Montalcino to the point where it was the poorest commune in the province of Siena as of 1950. That is not that long ago when you really think about that. We're talking 2020 today, 70 years ago. This area, it's hard for us to imagine with wines as important as Brunello di Montalcino and some of the price levels that we see for vineyards coming out of that area. It's hard to believe this area 70 years ago was really one of the poorest in all of Siena, and for that matter, one of the poorest in all of Tuscany. 1966, the Brunello di Montalcino DOC status is arriving. Only 76 hectares are in production in 1966, which again, you think about the number of producers today, you have over 250 producers in the area of Brunello di Montalcino, or should say in the area of Montalcino. It's hard to believe that at one time there were so few hectares under production and so few producers making wine as in 1966. The real critical next step after arriving into DOC status was the introduction of consulting enologist, consulting winemaker, or just tastemaker, a gentleman named Giulio Gambelli, who really was the first to introduce the concept of hygiene in cellars. This had a huge impact on the quality of wine coming from Montalcino. This gentleman, Giulio Gambelli, has since passed. He was iconic. He was known as the master taster, the master of Sangiovese in and around Tuscany. He had a huge impact on wineries like Poggio di Sotto, Soldera, Biondisanti, and many others in the way that they look at wine. Fattoria Barbi as an example in Montalcino, but also in Tuscany, Villa Rosa, which is in Castellina in Chianti, was his sort of everyday cellar because Giulio Gambelli was from Poggio-Bonzi, which is an industrial town on the outskirts of what became the area of Chianti Classico. And he had a huge impact with the Cecchi family now is the owner of Villa Rosa, but in this very historic property called Villa Rosa, and then also Montevertine, which is in Radin Chianti, and several other wonderful producers of Chianti Classico, or I should say just Sangiovese in and around Tuscany. But the real cornerstone to Giulio's philosophy that he learned from Tancredi Biondisanti was hygiene in cellars. Because at the time, again, hard to believe, but in the 70s and 60s, there were a lot of dirt floor cellars in and around Italy. So you can't think of Montalcino, you can't think of Chianti Classico, you can't think of Italy in general, specifically Tuscany, even in the 70s, as a place that would resemble anything like the great Chateau of Bordeaux or these historic cellars in Cave in Burgundy, because it wasn't the culture. Wine in Italy has always been and will always be, hopefully, just part of the table. It doesn't become the centerpiece to every discussion. And so it's a very casual consumption. It's part of the everyday life in Italy, and therefore it's celebrated as such. These are traditionally very simple, drinkable wines. And you had this sort of conversion in the 1970s into the mid-80s from quantity to quality. And Giulio Gambelli was really instrumental in doing all of that introduction of hygiene and cleanliness to wine. Again, maintaining the technically desirable parts of winemaking, but not removing the soul of Sangiovese. And that's where he was incredibly helpful and influential in all of these properties. He worked for the Consorzio of Brunello di Montalcino in the DOC as it was in the 1960s, and then DOCG in the 1970s and 80s. Italy became the first, Italy's first DOCG was Brunello di Montalcino in 1980. It is today the only DOCG that requires 100% Sangiovese. The DOC of Rosso di Montalcino is the only DOC that requires 100% Sangiovese. So between the 1970s and the 1980s, really the introduction of quality was instrumental and highly influential, and really opened the door to a very wealthy family from New York called the Mariani family, who came in and purchased Villa Banfi. And really they are largely responsible, given a lot of credit across Montalcino, for introducing the category of Brunello to the US market, and for that matter, to a lot of the export markets around the world. The Mariani family took the Villa Banfi wines and really bought it for the white grape Muscadella. They were trying to make sweet white wines to bring back to the United States for their wine business and sales in the US. And then they sort of interpreted what was going on with the incredible quality around the red wines coming from Brunello di Montalcino. And they basically converted their farm, Villa Banfi, which is enormous in the southwest portion of the area, converted that to largely Brunello di Montalcino production. And today they're one of the largest landowners, if not the largest landowner in the area of Montalcino, and have the most hectares under vine of DOCG Brunello di Montalcino. So a very influential family, even today, in terms of production and name recognition for the area of Montalcino. But arguably, there are smaller producers that are making some of the more compelling styles of Sangiovese and Montalcino. You know, for my money, I think that it's incredible what Villa Banfi was able to do, bringing wines to the U.S. And marketing Montalcino. But qualitatively, we see some amazing producers outside of Villa Banfi that have really become the forefront of people's minds for what we think of quality Brunelli Montalcino. But hugely important as it regards the history and even today, the exposure for Brunello di Montalcino. 1 in 4 bottles of Brunello di Montalcino is sold in the United States, just to give you some perspective there.